Today I'm speaking with Cindy Wang Brandt. Cindy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we had to coordinate our schedules a little bit here because you live in Taiwan. What
I
part of
do.
Taiwan are you in, by the way?
Kaohsiung, so it's the southern, like the second largest city in
Okay.
Taiwan.
Are you near the ocean as well?
Yes. Well, all of Taiwan is near the ocean. We're a small island.
Yeah.
So, but yes, I am. I can see the ocean right from my window
Beautiful.
here.
Beautiful. And I'm going to give a quick bio for Cindy. Cindy was born into a secular home, but she was sent to a school for missionary children in Taiwan, where she converted and spent her formative years in conservative evangelicalism. She also attended Wheaton College and Fuller Seminary here in the US, and she had a career in missions. And that's what I know about you so far. But I also want to mention for anyone that's a reader, she's also the author of Parenting Forward, which is a cool book. The subtitle of that is How to Raise Children with Justice, Mercy, and Kindness. I'm sure we'll touch on that shortly. And another book called You Are Revolutionary. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a children's book and it's about kids and activism. And it just comes from my belief that everyone has a right to have a say in the way they live their lives. And so it's a book that hopefully empowers kids to know that they could be a part of making a difference in the world. But I try to advocate for kids' inclusion of any public space. And so this is just another one of those
Hmm.
spaces that I'm advocating for. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And could you tell us something fun or one of your hobbies, something quirky about yourself?
Oh goodness. I just wrote a Substack. So I'm on Substack at Cindy Wang Brandt. And I just a few weeks ago wrote a piece that said that I want to start a fashion channel.
Nice.
Yeah, I was thinking about this today because I am a writer. And so as a writer, I am always trying to like find my niche, right? Like I work in a specific subject. And for me, it's parenting, deconstruction, faith spaces, that kind of stuff. But, our personas online is very limiting. It's just the one thing. And that's like good business sense, right? Like you should focus on a niche. But I have all these other interests, and throughout the years I've had all these other interests that really have nothing to do with anything. And so yeah, right now I guess one of my interests is sort of fashion, and but it is also kind of related to my religious trauma, because I find that fashion is a way that we express ourselves. It's a way that we kind of tell the world, signal to the world what's inside of us, in the way that we dress. And so in a way it's been fun and healing and empowering as well to get into it. And yeah, so I don't
That's,
know if that counts as a fun thing, but
yeah, that's awesome. I could imagine your kids getting excited about that too, helping out or getting involved.
no, they're not interested at all.
Oh no? Okay.
No, my kids are not very, yeah,
How old are they,
they're
by the
not.
way?
They're not. So I have a daughter who is 20, which is hard to believe. Yeah, she's in New York attending a concert right now, actually. And then I have a son still at home, and he is 17. I really struggle with my kids' ages because it changes every year.
Yeah. I usually
So
get my
I'm just,
kids ages right, but I get the birthdays or we've got four little ones, so it's easy to mix them up.
oh, you have four? Oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
eight ages, eight and under. So it's a
Oh my goodness. I can't believe I
it's a
can't believe you're here and
it's a
and
busy house.
doing work. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Oh wow.
as I
Cool.
pass the ball to you to kind of tell your story, I just want to make sure I mention too that Cindy has a website where I'm going to have the link beneath her video. I'm sure we'll talk about it again at the end, but she is involved in a lot of things that help parents break the cycles of toxic religiosity. She helps
Mm-hmm.
people unpack and heal from religious trauma so that we can raise
Mm-hmm.
our children with healthy worldviews and perspectives and just really empowering them on so many levels. So definitely please check her stuff out. I'll have the links for her. And with that, I did want to ask if you could, for those, I know a lot of people who probably watch my channel already know you, which is cool, know some of
Mm.
your story. But for anyone that doesn't know you, could you just talk us through who you are and what, where you're coming from in terms of what happened to bring you to Christianity and how that all evolved?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it in my bio. I was raised here in Taiwan. But then my parents sent me to the school. It's an evangelical missionary school that started by missionaries. And so it's like the ethos of the school is very much like conservative evangelicalism in America in the 90s, which is, of course, when I went to school. And so I converted there. I did the whole prayer, I was evangelized too. I was told that if I could die tonight and, I want to make sure that I got into heaven. And I had a lot of death anxiety as a child. And so I was an easy target, quite vulnerable. And then I'm also, I'm the type of person that just kind of, I'm like 100% like obsess over this one thing, and I realize I'm learning that about myself as the decades of my life go on. I just kind of go on from thing to thing. And very unfortunately, when I was a child, that thing was Christianity. And so I was very serious, very passionate, very committed to my faith. And so I went to a Christian college, which is unheard of for, a Taiwanese person like me, like who's a lot of the cultural expectations are for me to get into a prestigious college and, become a doctor, lawyer, whatever. And here I am going to a school that it was almost like I knew if I chose a school that I was going to become a missionary, and which is what I did. So it was very radical. And it's like I wanted to be radical. That was encouraged, right? In evangelical Christian faith. I didn't want to be lukewarm. So that's kind of been my path. I went to college, I went to seminary. Then I became a missionary for about 5.5 years. And then we left and then I moved my family back to Taiwan, which is my home. And we've been living here ever since. So, yeah. And then, so once I left the mission field, I really went through a bit of an identity crisis because I was like, what? I was very uncomfortable with the missionary life because I discovered it was much ado about nothing. It sounds so glamorous on paper, but once you got into the field, which I just think is such a funny thing to say when you're like, you mean you're just overseas? But as I'm on the field, I realize, what are people doing? What am I doing? What are people doing? There's a lot of fluff and like, I don't know if you guys ever followed Jamie, the very worst missionary. Well, I followed her and just really resonated with a lot of what she was saying because I was a missionary and yeah, it's so easy to fool your supporters and really to fool yourself too, as you're writing those letters to your supporters, be like, I'm doing very important work. Anyway, so that was that. And, so I left and so I started that was kind of the emergence of blogging in the late 2000s. And so I started consuming blogs and then, like a lot of things, I just decided, well, I could do this too. And so I started blogging and so I started documenting sort of my faith journey. And I started off I was a Christian. And so I was writing about my faith and kind of a different kind of faith than what I was seeing. And then I slowly, deconstructed more and more. And then along the way, I accumulated more and more religious trauma, partly, I would say mostly because I was writing publicly about it. How dare somebody have a voice and be out loud. I mean, the scene is so different now because there's so many deconstruction voices now, but back in the late 2000s, there really weren't a lot, it was a much smaller community. And so it was like, oh, wow. I guess I attracted attention and I realized that being who I am was really unacceptable in the evangelical world. And so I left.
Can I ask a few questions about your earlier part of the story?
Sure.
You mentioned being born into a home where your parents weren't Christians. Did your parents have any concerns or objections when you told them that you were now a Christian?
No, because, the Christians are very good at, well, for them, it was like they were sending us to a wholesome school. Like, this is a wholesome school. And the school was going to teach us good morals. and it was safe environment, so I think that's what they thought of Christianity. And Christianity teaches about love and caring for, about sacrifice and these very inspirational stories. And so I think it was appealing to them in that way. So no, they didn't see the red flags, unfortunately. And I can't say I blame them, because I was vulnerable to it as well. Of course, I was a child, but and they just wanted the best they wanted me to get a good education, and they felt like that was the best way. So no, they weren't concerned. And it was better than doing drugs, right? And going to Bible study just seemed like a benign activity.
Sure. Absolutely. When you mentioned, placing your faith in Christ there and how they were effectively preying on your fear of death, can you tell us a little bit more about what it was like to hear that teaching or preaching? Like, what was actually some of the details of that story, and what was it like to actually give your life to Christ?
Yeah, I don't know. I just remember for as long as I could remember, I was terrified of death, and it was anxiety. Now I know I have anxiety, but also death is kind of scary, and for a little kid. Although I know actually there are a lot of kids who are simply curious about death. They're not necessarily anxious, but I was very anxious. And so I remember before I encountered Christianity, there were folklore in my culture about like hell. There are also mythologies about hell, and it was very scary to me. So that probably contributed to my imagination. And so but then there were solutions too, right? In these children's tales about the pill that gives you everlasting life. And, there are certain lore and like Chinese emperors that strive for the everlasting life. And I was always really fascinated by that. And I saw the appeal. I was like, I would like that. And I remember being jealous of like things like rocks, because they lasted so long, so much longer than a human life, stuff like that. I just had a lot of anxiety. And so, yeah, when I encountered Christianity, I was 12 years old. It was just like kind of an easy sell, right? It's like, oh, all I have to do is pray and I can have eternal life. And yeah, and there were, lots of narratives and stories. Like I wrote about this in a recent Substack as well, where they put a coffin on stage in chapel, and in the coffin, there was a mirror inside. So they had all the students line up, go up, look in the mirror, and it's like, oh, you imagine that you can end up there. So what are you going to do? Right? Raise your hand if you're ready. So lots of illustrations like that. I do think evangelicals are quite obsessed about death and gore. It's Jesus on a cross. That's the central symbol. So, yeah, it's all very quite morbid. But of course, supposedly, so that they could present this gospel of hope.
And were they telling you, I assume, that if you did not believe, you'd go to hell?
Exactly. Yes. Definitely. Yeah. So that was, yeah. So I very much advocate against this. I think if you threaten children with hell, that is spiritual abuse. So it's abuse. It is psychological abuse. And it's unjust.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of other bad messages in there, I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. When you were growing up, though, as you placed your faith in Christ, and obviously, you didn't know where you'd end up today with your worldview, but as you're growing up with it, you're obviously going towards missions. Was that just part of like everybody in your school was kind of doing that, or were you the exception to that? And like, what was the driving passion for you to get involved in missions so much?
Yeah, I was. So I went to a school that was founded by missionaries for missionary kids. So it was very much, I was steeped in it.
Yeah.
And I read lots of missionary biographies. I went to Wheaton College, who was famous for Jim Elliot, who attended there, and he was a martyr. Yeah, so very much I was in that world. And missionaries I felt like glorified in my circles. So it was like the highest level of Christian that you could do. And I'm kind of an achiever. So I'm like, well, I'm going to aim for the top. So
Yeah.
if what does it mean to be the best Christian I could possibly be was to become a missionary. And even there's levels, right? Like, the Book of Mormon, you could go to Florida, or you could go to Uganda.
Yeah.
So which is the more, the Book of Mormon was so cathartic for me. I loved it. It was a huge instrument in my deconstruction. It was so cathartic. I love it. I have yet to see it, but I've listened to the soundtrack. I listened to the Book of Mormon soundtrack when my kids were in middle school, which in hindsight is not appropriate at all for kids that age, but I made them listen to it. And you know what? They both, now that they're older, they both love it. And so I was like, sorry that I introduced that to you guys when you're in middle school.
That's awesome. So I can definitely relate to some of your background there too, with the desire to do the biggest and best things. And it's you mentioned before, not wanting to be lukewarm. We used to even sing songs about, I don't want to be a casual Christian. And
That's
certainly
right.
in Revelation, it talks about, if you're lukewarm, I want to spew you out of my mouth. But
That's
I was the
right.
same. I went to Bible college to be a pastor. I got convinced that pastors should not be young men, which I was at the time. So I was like, God, what do you want me to do now? And it's like the doors just opened of missions work. I was like, this is my passion. I love languages. And so I got involved with a group called New Tribes Mission, which is now called Ethnos 360. And my goal was to be a Bible translator in a jungle tribal environment. And I thought of that, like you said, is like, this is the best
the epitome
possible life. Yeah.
That's right.
Absolutely. Apart from being actually like martyred, where someone holds a gun to your head and says, I'm totally say you don't believe in Jesus right now, or die. That was obviously like the best way to go out if you had to go out.
That's right. Yeah.
But if you otherwise
the martyr complex.
Life, but if you're otherwise going to live a long life, spend it sharing the gospel.
I thought about that all the time. I was told stories about these martyr stories, and I was always playing in my head, what would I do if somebody held a gun to my head? And thinking back, that's a horrible way to fill your imagination as an adolescent. I mean, I spent way too much time pondering that question. What would I do? Would I, disown Jesus or not?
Yeah. A lot of guilt too, like this sense of if you waver in your mind even a little bit, like you're not committed enough. It's a lot of pressure, a lot of guilt.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of your just your transition from college and seminary and then to missions, you mentioned the Book of Mormon, but what were some of the early seeds that began to make you question if there was something wrong with your worldview?
Yeah, I mean, there's like in a lot of ways it's a slow burn. I think I became more and more progressive. I just kept shifting to the left. So at first it was kind of still within the Christian tradition. So I became a progressive Christian. I first I remember thinking, well, going to Fuller was a step to the left from Wheaton because Fuller is more inclusive. They don't believe the Bible is inerrant, and then slowly then it was like, oh, do I even believe in the resurrection? And so all these doctrines just kept turning. But then it's also my life experience, right? Like as a woman and a woman of color. And I'm married to a white guy. And it was like so strange the way I was treated differently. I couldn't understand it, which is such a optimistic of me. I was just naive to these racial and sexist dynamics. And I just was like, I kind of had the audacity to be treated equally, right? And when I wasn't, and I just saw a disconnect between that and the gospel, which I was supposed to believe in. So that began to really break down some of my views. But it's very scary to deconstruct because we were threatened with hell. So our brains literally wired in a way to keep us within the fold. And so I think that's why it took so long, because the farther away I am from it, the more it seems crazy to me. And it's like, I can't believe that I didn't just say, what, this is stupid, but that's just the way I think our brains work, and the way indoctrination works.
Yeah.
So it took a long time, but there were some inciting incidents as well. Like my brother is trans, and so when he came out as trans, and this is before the trans that before we got this much trans visibility. So it was very that was a big deal. And at that time, I was, I remember knowing just deep in my bones that my faith was going to reject my brother. And at that point, I was like, well, I'm going to support my brother. So that was my first like real firm departure from the faith of my upbringing. I just knew that was what I had to do.
Did you feel at all like you were being disloyal to Jesus by making that choice?
I can't say that I even cared at that point, to be honest. Yeah, I didn't. I was just like, I don't care. This feels right to me. And yeah, so maybe I was more deconstructed than I thought I was. Yeah, Tim, I'm really sorry. It's just been so long. It's like 20 years ago now these things have happened. And so I feel like my memory has been garbled. And I also think religious trauma does mess with your memories. And I definitely do have religious trauma. So I apologize if I'm not like totally clear on like my timeline and stuff,
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It makes sense.
Yeah.
I feel the same way very much. And it feels at times like somebody will say something in an interview and it'll feel like as I'm listening to their story, it's reminding me of something. It helps me kind of peel the layers of the onion back. I'm like, oh yeah. I'm like, I haven't thought about that in 20 years, but that's definitely part of my story too. It's very helpful, but it's also at times painful because you're like, oh, that actually shaped my worldview. This, that story or that trauma, it shaped me. And you realize you have to kind of figure out, how did it shape me? And is it still shaping me in some way?
Well, I'll tell you a story. So this is years ago, I would say 8-9 years ago. There was this evangelical woman, and at the time I was still Christian. And so she and I, we were just friends and we were getting together. And then she said something about being a submissive wife, and then I like pushed back and I was just like, what? This is not what I believe in. And then she sent me an email to follow up on that, to follow up on what she had said. And I remember that email as being like so nasty, so judgmental, so hurtful, and like calling me out as like a heretic. And so I would tell the story, maybe even in my blogging and stuff, I would tell the story like I was rejected and this woman, we're so different. And then years later, I went back and I dug up that email and I read it. And it was so benign. Like she was as kind as could be. And I don't know, I think at the time I was pushing away. I was trying to differentiate myself from this group of people. I was deconstructing, and because of my framework, I projected so much animosity and division into that one email that I had received. So ever since then, I've kind of distrusted my own memories of things because I know my religious trauma has clouded a lot of things. And I have been on so many podcasts telling the story of my deconstruction. And, that like the more I learn about memory and how it's really not that reliable, and then realizing that myself, I've just become like kind of ultra aware of how limited my own retelling of my story is. But anyway, I do my best.
It's a good reminder, though. It's something we probably all should be keeping in mind for our stories too. I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. So then there's that, my brother coming out as trans. And then I think when you take a stand for LGBTQ affirmation, that's really what do you call it? A
watershed moment.
Yeah, a watershed moment, or it's a way that the Christians decide if you're in or out, right? Yes. And so I think from that moment on, it was just they just pushed me more and more further away from that world, even though I felt like I still was a part of it. I very much felt alienated until so I was working at an evangelical school, and then I went to Gay Pride. I posted a picture of Gay Pride, and then I was taken into the superintendent's office, and then he told me that I cannot be posting about gay pride on Facebook as long as I'm an employee of the school. And so I resigned the next day. So, and that was kind of it, you know. I was like, well, you really did just push me out, and you really just decided that I'm not welcome here. And but that was very traumatic for me, you know. That was a very hard time in my life, and a lot of my a lot that would be the incident that caused. I mean, I would say I have religious trauma from being told I was going to hell when I was 12 years old. But in terms of like an incident that really, you know, had a drastic impact on my life, that was it. And that was in 2016.
Okay. Could I ask too, like, when you look at that, you know, that you might categorize that as you know, people in the church who are making bad choices and hurting you, they're creating trauma, but that's a little different from your quiet relationship with Jesus behind the scenes, so to speak. You know, people can be obnoxious and hurt you, but you know, there's still, you know, you with Jesus and an open Bible, you know, so to speak, hearing from God and you talking back and having that relationship. Was there a point at which that began to be in question where you kind of said, I'm not sure, like, if this is, in my words, maybe from my experience, if this is real? Or like, how did you transition from just the church as being obnoxious to questioning your faith in Jesus and God and the Bible?
That's such a good question. I think that for me, my personal faith and devotion was always wrapped up with the community of Christianity. And I was taught that, right? That was how I was raised. I was taught that I don't have a faith apart from the community that I'm in. And so to me, it was all wrapped up in one. And so I think as I began to question the teachings that I was receiving from church and from whatever, then it was simultaneous. You know, I simultaneously began to question my own faith and my personal beliefs, and it just didn't make sense. I think it just stopped making sense. So I stopped doing I think when I stopped doing devotions when I had kids, because I was too tired. I would rather sleep. So that was in 2003. I had my daughter in 2003. So way back then, even though we did still take my kids to church, we were part of, you know, Christian organizations, I had stopped having any kind of private faith with God.
Well, can I ask it this way? Did you feel like you were kind of talking to him, like in the sense, what I mean is, you know, there's the verse, I think in 1 Thessalonians, pray without ceasing. And you get to a point where, you know, the theology, you know, the things you've learned and that you have been preached to, that have been preached to you, they go from being like in your mind to just being part of your psyche, part of your worldview, where you're kind of breathing God in and breathing God out. You're looking, when you look at people, you see people, but you see people in the context of what am I supposed to do to help them draw closer to God? And you know, you look at yourself in the mirror and you think, I'm not looking at me, I'm looking at myself in the context of God. I might have a day or a month or a year left, whatever, of my life, but every minute is yours. I'm your servant. My time is yours.
I definitely thought that way.
How did you, like, were you still praying for that time frame when you said you kind of stopped devotions? Were you still talking to God and were you asking him to kind of clear up some of these issues and saying, God, even though the church is not what I expected, where do you fit in this?
I can't say I did. No, I think I've always been a kind of a cerebral Christian, even when I was a Christian. So I didn't ever I never got into, like, my husband was into YWAM. So he went through that whole like listening to the Spirit. And I just never, I have never heard the voice of God ever in my life. I was like, there's nothing.
Yeah.
And like my family can speak in tongues, and like everyone had these very spiritual experiences, and I just never did. Like my faith very much lived in my head. So
Did
like a
that frustrate you?
rational. At times it made me feel like, oh, how come I didn't get the gift, right? But for the most part, I was kind of scared, to be honest. I was a little bit scared of all that stuff too. So I was kind of glad that I didn't speak in tongues and I didn't get swept up in those kinds of things. Like I prided myself in more of the like the work ethic and I could memorize lots of scripture. So yeah, very cerebral, right? Like I memorize lots of scripture. I'm willing to do really hard things, like go live in a difficult place to live in. And like I could do that. But in terms of the woo-woo stuff, and I'm still that way, even post-Christian, I don't get into woo-woo stuff. I'm not really very spiritual. Yeah. So no, I don't think I was frustrated with the lack of hearing God's voice or feeling like, why aren't you helping me reconcile my issues? As I was working out how these doctrines don't make sense, I'm just like, oh, so maybe, yeah, you just start to kind of question if it was real, if any of it is real, or if it's all made up.
What was the final period of time like when you just kind of eventually said, I'm fully out, like this isn't real. I'm done with that worldview?
Yeah, I I don't know if I'm even past that, because it just feels so much safer to not say that. But yeah,
Safer for you talking to yourself, or you with how other
safer
people
to
will?
me talking to myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just feels a little easier to just be like, oh, I am just the way I am. It's kind of like, I don't want to identify as anything. I'm just going to identify as me, which I think is a bit of a cop out, but it's like, I'll take it because it makes me feel safe. But I do feel like I'm functionally an atheist. I don't believe in God, and I do think it's all made up. But I talked to you a little bit before we started recording. I feel like atheism has a real bad reputation in terms of just kind of arrogance and that certainty and disrespect for religious people that I don't like. So I don't like to identify as an atheist, but I say I'm functionally an atheist because I don't believe there is a God. But see, yeah, even saying that is so scary. Like, did I just say that out loud?
Well, can I take that what you just said back to what you said earlier about the fear of death? How did you, when you realized, at some point, I don't believe this stuff anymore, how did that affect your ability to deal with questions about the afterlife, and where have you landed so far with that?
I think that I realized that there were two separate things going on. There's existential questions about life after death, and then there's anxiety. And I realized that I have anxiety. I still do. And so I can see how my existentials and my anxiety collided when I was a kid, to create something quite overwhelming, And I think as I grew up, I developed more mature systems. My nervous system matured. I was able to manage my anxiety a lot better. So that's why because I work in the parenting space, a lot of parents who have kids with death anxiety, I always tell them, I know it's not totally true. We cannot guarantee that our children won't die, but it's okay to tell kids you won't have to worry about death for a very long time, because they do grow up. And I know that's true because I did. I grew up and I was able to cope with the idea of death better as an older human being. And so I realized that I had anxiety. Now that I've managed my anxiety, then I could worry about the existential questions of death. And when I would think about death and I would start to panic and be very afraid, then I realized that's anxiety. And so I would use the tools that I've learned, meditation or cognitive behavior therapy, or just all these tools that I know to manage my anxiety. And when the anxiety melts away, then death is not so scary. I don't think that there is life after death. This is what I think right now. I think that maybe we return to dust. I like the physicians, I don't know if you've seen that. You want a physicist to speak at your funeral because it's this beautiful kind of poetic view of how we turn into particles and we are a part of this world again. And I love that. Or even returning to dust, I think is a beautiful thing, that we kind of complete the circle of life and we go back to nourishing the earth and giving life to some other organism. So that's beautiful to me. So I don't personally struggle very much with, like, some people, even after they deconvert, they feel like, I can't imagine that there's nothing after death. To me, that doesn't bother me. I think it's okay that there's nothing. I think we can tell a story, which I think religion is also a story, right? It's a way we construct a narrative that makes sense of life. And I think even post Christianity, I can still tell stories that is meaningful to me. And so that story of like nourishing the earth is meaningful to me, and still being a part of this world with my loved ones and in the memories of my loved ones, that's meaningful to me. So yeah, I'm kind of happy to say that that's not something I struggle with very much anymore.
That's awesome. I definitely don't struggle with it either, but I definitely was one of those people that wanted to live forever. Like, I've had some people, and I maybe I'll ask you this too in a second, but I bet people say to me, do you really think you would have wanted to live forever and ever and ever and ever and ever? Like,
Yeah.
really? Wouldn't you get bored? And I honestly don't think I would, but do you think you would have wanted to live forever if you could?
Well, did you watch The Good Place?
I've watched a little bit of it, but I didn't get to the end, no.
Okay. Well, do you mind if I tell you the spoiler?
No, go for it.
So at the end of The Good Place, they do end up being in the version of heaven, and everyone's happy and everyone's with their people that they love and they live forever. But then there is an option. There's this door that you can step through, and when you step through it, then it's over. Then that life is over. And so the main characters, the couple, the guy, he was ready to step through the door, but then she loves him and she doesn't want to say goodbye to him, so she's like, no, please stay. And so he's like, okay, I'll stay. And so they keep living, but then she senses, she's like, you're ready to go, aren't you? And so then he steps through the door, and that's it. And so it's this idea that you can be happily ever after in this place that's heaven, but there's also something. I think finitude is kind of what gives life meaning. Like, if something ends, that's what makes the life that we have living worth living. And so that makes sense to me. So I do think that having a limit on life then ultimately makes the life that we live more meaningful. So no, I don't think I want to live forever and ever.
Gotcha. Sounds like it shows a tearjerker there. I need to watch that at some point. Sure, that's an emotional roller coaster to watch something like that.
It's very philosophical. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you don't mind my asking, you mentioned your husband. Where was he with all the deconversion process? How did he fit into this? Did he follow you?
Yeah, we've had parallel deconstruction journeys. So he has his own version and I have my own version. And thankfully, we've been pretty much on the same page. Not, of course, no two people can be totally on the same page at all times, but a same-ish page. So it's been okay. And I feel very lucky because we got married very young, as evangelical culture dictates. And so it could have turned out differently, and it does turn out differently for a lot of people. But for us, we've just kind of been able to keep pace with each other.
So as you shared questions and doubts, that wasn't a threat at all?
I think at times it was. Yeah, but then at times the things he would say would threaten me. Yeah. In fact, like, I remember he was the one that was like, I'm done with hell, and I was like, I think I remember feeling like I think inside I agreed with him, but I was, like I said, I'm afraid to say these things out loud, and so he just said it out loud, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess we're done, So there's a sense of, I think it was nice to go through deconstruction with him, because we kind of gave each other a little bit of security, permission to kind of take the next step forward. I do have to say that whole Jezebel narrative, the idea that the woman leads the man astray, like sometimes I don't think it's true at all, but I feel the pressure of that narrative because I'm the one that's a lot more public, talking about these things. And so I have this fear that people think my husband deconstructed because of me. It's not true. If you ask him, he'll tell you that it's not true. But, I do have that pressure, feeling like the Jezebel.
When you were raising your kids and you're deconverting, where was that in the timeline? Like, were your kids exposed to Christianity at all?
Yeah. So when they were little, we were still missionaries.
Okay.
And so we went to church and we did ministry. And then when we moved back to Taiwan, we sent them to the same missionary school that I went to. So they've grown up in an evangelical missionary school. So they very much know the whole thing. In fact, my son has like, he has Jesus stickers on his laptop. I was like, oh my goodness. Although it's like, I'm like, is that ironically or not ironically? I don't know. But yeah, so they know all the worship songs and stuff like that. But
are either one of them still believers?
I would say no. Gotcha. My daughter, definitely not.
At the time, though, going back to the earlier part of your story, when you were raising them in church and so forth, and then you were deconverting, at what point did you feel like you could share it, and how did they react? Were they concerned for your eternal state at that point, or was it like a slow conversation?
No. Yeah. I think that they were young enough when we started really changing our minds a lot. So I wouldn't say we ever raised them fundamentalist. I mean, we maybe raised them progressive Christian at most, when they were younger. So that was good, because that is, at least, I don't think we gave them a lot of harmful messages. Now they got it from school, but we were, because of our own experience, like I'm not like my parents, right? Like I knew the red flags and I was there to make sure that they didn't fall for the indoctrination at school. So I was maybe overly, right, careful with them. So I don't think that they ever adopted those fears. Yeah, I don't think they ever adopted those fears. So that was good. But they know about our deconstruction. We do tell stories. And then, of course, my whole like dramatic resignation from the school, that was their school. So I had to be very careful because it was my choice and it's my journey and it's my deconstruction and it's my trauma. I didn't want that to negatively impact them for something that was my choice. So I tried to keep a lot of that private, just between me and my husband and my community online and stuff like that, and let them kind of live their lives as they deserve to. So awesome. For the most part, I think it worked out okay. Yeah.
You've mentioned the word religious trauma a few times. I don't know, we've talked already about hell and fear of death and so forth, but could you elaborate on any other main threads of religious trauma that you feel were really a part of your story?
Yeah. So I discovered I have religious trauma probably a few years ago, maybe a couple of years after my adverse religious experience, which is that resignation from the school. And I think at first it manifested as just triggers. I was very easily triggered. So one time I was back in America and somebody invited us out to church, and I had a near panic attack. Like I just was my nervous system. I was just so overwhelmed and so distressed, to the point of like, I was like hyperventilating. And so I was like, okay, well, something's wrong. Something's not quite right with this body of mine, that I would have that kind of reaction to just being asked to go to church. Yeah. And so that was kind of when I started to explore. And, there's like Instagram accounts that talk about religious trauma. And I started learning, and just complex trauma in general. And just realizing, my body is feeling this overwhelm. And my body's not feeling safe. And it's because I have trauma, religious trauma. So I actually run a membership now called Parenting After Religious Trauma, for people who want to recover from religious trauma. And, all the work that I do, I usually do it because I need it. So that's been the journey of realizing that. And it's been wonderful, because it's kind of like when you know the diagnosis, then you can work towards a cure. When I realized that I had religious trauma, then I knew what I could do about it. Religious trauma is a wound that can be healed. Adverse religious experiences, it cannot be changed, that those things happen to me and I can't go back in time and change that, but I can do something about the religious trauma that I have. And I have, I try to just work on recovery. And it's like, I had mentioned that I was a very cerebral Christian, and I was a very cerebral person who deconstructed. I was a writer, I was writing ideas, and everything was up here in my head. But religious trauma lives in your body, and I could not write myself, I could not think myself out of these triggers that I have. I had to take care of my body. And I was having other symptoms too. I have an irritable bowel syndrome. I have heartburn. Like, my body was exhibiting signs of stress and distress. So that's the journey that I've been on in the past few years. I'm not writing quite as much, and I'm not arguing online. I'm almost off of all social media, because I can't recover by thinking and writing my way through this. I have to, breathe and drink water and exercise.
Can I ask, bringing it to back to as well to your children in this context, and other children, when you hear and you remember the messages of, you were born as a child of Adam and Eve, and you inherited this sin nature, you're inherently wicked, you're broken, you're desperately wicked, all your righteousness is like a filthy rag. What goes through your mind and your heart when you just or hear that message is going to small children from the earliest ages? I mean, the earliest days of their lives. You're broken and you're wicked. And even John 3 talks about, if you believe, then your condemnation is past, but before you believe, you're already condemned. Like, you stand condemned just by being born.
That's right. Yeah.
How do you respond to
it's
that?
extremely damaging. It's very, very damaging, because it's really the best way for religious systems to control a human being, to take your autonomy away from you. It's to say that you're not in charge of your life. You can't be trusted. And of course, when it happens to really young babies, it's devastating, because then parents think that any kind of misbehavior is a product of sin, when children don't misbehave. They're trying to get their needs met. They cry, they throw tantrums, they exhibit problematic behaviors because they have a need that needs to be filled. And instead of trying to fill that need and meet that need, they punish, right? The parents punish and shame. And that's devastating to child development. And it perpetuates a really terrible cycle for a child. So the original sin doctrine is very damaging for children and for adults too, of course. But it is, you have to admit, a genius way to control somebody, because if you don't trust yourself, then the religious systems gets to tell you what you should do. And so it's effective.
Did you ever get that message that every time you sin, it's like you're pounding the nails into his?
Yes, you nailed Jesus to the cross. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
I
Yeah, that's so it leads to hypervigilance and
yep.
perfectionism and anxiety, which I
Mm.
already had. So
And in the context, I would say of purity culture, just my experience, the whole thing of don't look twice, don't think about certain things as you're hitting puberty. That message of like every time you have a sexual thought as a young
Mhm.
person, you're nailing the nails into Christ, and you feel like your hormones are driving you one direction, and yet your
Mhm.
spiritual worldview is driving you the other. And
Yeah, it's
I remember a
horrible.
time when I literally felt like I was just like, God, I sense I'm denying you, like actually as if I'm not denying Christ verbally, but denying you with my life. And I
Mhm.
hate it. I hate myself. And of course, you identify
Mm.
that with like, okay, well, that's what Romans 7 says. I hate
Yeah,
the things that are in me, but there's a war going on. The things
that's
that I
right.
hate, the sin,
Yeah.
and the new man that's being created in Christ. But it's like because you think that that's all real, you don't think it's mythology. You end up thinking when you do lose that you're basically giving Christ a finger, and it's
Yeah.
like, oh, it
Well, it's
breaks
the
your
whole
heart.
every man's battle, right? Like my husband and I are convinced that all the Christian songs, all the CCM songs are about that battle. It's like, oh, they looked at porn and they sat down and wrote those lyrics, like second chances. Like Bebo Norman talks about second chances so much, and we're just like, he must really have liked porn.
It certainly would does make sense, yeah, that there's a lot of those kind of backgrounds to it. I wouldn't be surprised at all if a lot of those were with that in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, for
How did
sure.
you, on the note of purity culture, how did that affect you?
Oh my goodness. Where do we even begin?
Well, how about what were the
uh
main messages that they taught you even before you even knew that there was trauma involved? Just what were the main things that you remember them telling you?
Yeah. I mean, I think for men, purity culture tells men that any sexual thought that you have is sin. And then for women, we just weren't allowed to be sexual. We didn't know that, and I mean, of course, we were also taught that we can't lead our brothers to stumble and that we were basically objectified because we are walking lust objects for men. Um, so I don't know, that never really impacted me very badly. I don't know. I was pretty disassociated from my body growing up evangelical anyway. So I didn't really think about that too much. But I think the way it affected me was I didn't understand that I was a sexual being, because women really, we were never really taught that. We were taught that we were just objects of sex. We didn't have agency over sex. So yeah, I told my husband, I was like, I think for most of my life I thought I was asexual, even though I have a sex life with my husband. Because I just didn't understand sex. And that's the thing, there's also a lot of sexual silence, right? Like it was either shame and all that stuff, or there was nothing. And we had no comprehensive sex ed. I didn't know my own anatomy. I didn't know what I didn't know arousal. I didn't know any of that. I didn't understand the mechanics. I didn't understand it for myself. I didn't understand it for other women. I didn't understand it for men. So I didn't know the difference between attraction and desire. Like we didn't have conversations about that within purity culture. It was just don't do it, and that's it. Don't have sex before marriage, and that's all we knew. We didn't know how to have sex after marriage. you know, um, so yeah, it's been definitely a learning experience, clawing myself out of purity culture. But I'm happy to say that I'm quite sex positive now, and it's interesting now that I have adopted a more sex positive worldview, how much of the world is sex negative. You just kind of see it in a different light, and it still is, even outside of evangelicalism, it's very sex negative. For instance, recently I saw on, do you know Humans of New York, that very popular page?
Yeah.
Do you know it?
Mm-hmm.
Did you see that he posted a picture of this man who cheated on his wife?
I haven't seen it recently, no, but feel free to
Okay.
talk about it.
Yeah. So yeah, so he posted a picture of this guy. I don't think he posted his face, but and then he always has captions that tell the story, right? And so this man is just like, yeah, I slept with this other woman and something to the effect of that. Basically, he cheated on his wife. And yeah, and I read the comment section and it was very like very judgmental, right? People were, yeah, just judged him. And not that I don't judge him, because I don't think he should have cheated on his wife, but there's no nuance and no understanding of what it's like to have sexual desires. When you're married, you still have sexual desires. Even if you're married to a partner, and how that plays out. How do you decide, make the decisions? Like there's just not very much nuance in public discourse about sex. It's very much black and white, which I think is a remnant of purity culture. And so I think purity culture, we got it really bad in evangelicalism for sure, but it is very much part of the wider discourse as well.
Yeah,
so
I totally agree. It feels like too, when you deconvert, you do realize, I know it's not a word that you would probably use, but for me, when you deconvert, you realize it all changes. Like you realize that even of course the word sin isn't a real thing anymore.
That's
but
right.
Even the word like lust has this negative connotation. Like, well,
yeah,
I could use the word attraction and desire and so
Mhm.
forth, but I wouldn't use the word lust anymore because I'm like,
Yeah, it's
that's
too loaded.
yeah, and it's like you
Has a lot of
realize,
baggage.
yeah, and also that there's other options. There's once you realize that the whole construct that we've been living under is part of this system. Not that you necessarily will pick all the different options, but that you just think morally, polyamory is fine. Like if a couple really wants to, that's not a poor choice for them if they're totally agree with that.
That's
And
right.
it's like it shifts, and and I think it also gives you that freedom to think I'm allowed to just think of life as much more erotic and full of life than I've ever thought of before. And
Yeah,
obviously
it's
you have to be
wonderful.
careful how you explore that, but with healthiness, that's a great thing to think I can totally enjoy myself and think absolutely nothing of there's some invisible God looking at me and looking in the bedroom looking at us. It's like
Yeah.
it's just you.
Unless
And
that's your thing.
yeah.
Then it's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I know we need to keep moving for the sake of time. I did want to ask you a little bit about the whole idea of raising kids to be critical thinkers. We're living in a world where there seems, in my mind, there's a huge disparity and cognitive dissonance between there's so much science, there's so much knowledge, there's so much growth of information, and yet there's so much, in my opinion, so much mythology and even tribal mythology in the sense of like an animistic worldview of knock on wood, so nothing bad happens to me. Like this whole mysticism side to us that comes out so prevalently. How do you feel we can start to wean ourselves off of that mythological worldview stuff and start to raise the next generations to be a little bit more, hopefully more rational than we were growing up, and to say, you can be a critical thinker and say, it doesn't mean you have to attack everyone else that you don't agree with, but just to say, you can say, I'm not, if I don't see evidence for this, I'm not going to agree with it until I see evidence that it's actually true. Like, how did that play out for you and your family?
That's an interesting question. I mean, education, right? Like I'm big on education. I think I don't know that I ever thought I'm going to raise my kids to be critical thinkers. It's funny because I wrote a parenting book and my subtitle is How to Raise Children with Justice, Mercy, and Kindness. But I actually, I don't think that you can force your child to be kind or just or merciful. I don't believe in this posture of like, this is what we do and we will produce a child who is like this, even if it's benign things like being kind and generous. Like, I think actually forcing a child to be generous is unjust. So when I say how to raise children with justice, mercy, and kindness, I'm talking about how we can be just and merciful and kind to our children. And so when it comes to critical thinking, I think, Yeah, I do think that a lot of that is modeled, right? Parenting is caught, not taught. So I hope that, so for instance, we vaccinated our kids. We vaccinated our kids for everything that there is a vaccination for, and we vaccinated them for COVID. And, there were a lot of anti-vaxxers and these voices. And so when that happened, we would talk to our kids and would be like, okay, talk about the science, talk about how the mRNA vaccine has been in research for a very long time, and that we can trust the doctors and the scientists, and that there's consensus from the majority of the scientific community, so we talk about these things, and hopefully all of that is helping them to form a lens to view the world with some reason and critical thinking. We do talk a lot about how you can't just trust whatever people say. And of course I grew up in an evangelical school, so we said that a lot. Just because they're your teachers doesn't mean that everything they say is right.
Can I ask, did that apply to evolution? Like, would they have been
oh yes, oh my goodness, they have to give a debate, which I was so frustrated with. I just think it's such a waste of time, because it's not even a debate. I don't care if you're on the side of like evolution. Just having to debate it, I just think it's just a waste of time. But it's part of their curriculum, so they had to do that, and so they had to deal with us just complaining about that.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that how much sheltering can occur in some of these groups where you just don't get the right information, to even know. I mean, number one, they kind of poison the well and vilify all these, secular people that say the earth is, this many billions of years old. You get this sense of like, they're just wicked people who want to worship the devil. So don't even listen to their textbooks and so forth. But when you shelter people so much where they don't even know that that's out there, or you let them know, yeah, it's out there, but they're really bad people saying that.
Yeah.
It's not even like you care. You just don't even, you want to ignore that information because you want to get the truth, the Bible. And then when you realize later, oh, wait, there's a lot of information out there that I actually wish I had, because some of it's really critical to know.
That's right. Yeah.
It shifts you. It makes you think, what else don't I know? What else? And it helps you to honestly deconstruct more, because you're like, I know now that I don't know. I know enough to know that I don't know, and I know that what I don't know, I needed to know, and I should have known.
Yeah, well, you're like, well, they lied to me about this. What else did they lie to me about, right?
Yeah.
So it's wonderful. It's good to have that curiosity. Keep asking, what else did they lie to you about? I felt that, I'm like, they lied to me about everything.
Did that make you go through any kind of angry phase as you realized that?
Very, very. I spent a lot of angry years. I would say that I am not quite as angry anymore, but that might be because I'm not on social media as much, because the algorithms do reward, controversy and these strong, angry feelings. But yes, I was very angry for many years, and I actually wrote a piece about this, but I discovered that my anger is really grief. It was masking my grief, that I was grieving my vulnerability. I was grieving the way that I was treated that way. I was grieving my kind of my misfortune, right? Because I could have been in another situation where I wasn't indoctrinated. I was grieving my own behavior and actions, the ways that I harm people, which is one of the hardest things for me to grieve, and
meaning ways that you passed on the indoctrination.
Well, for example, I used to be pro-life, right? And I don't think I was like a huge activist, but maybe I inadvertently said some things, which I find to be abhorrent now, the pro-life position, right? I believe in women's autonomy over their own bodies. And so I don't know. See, I don't remember all the things that I did and said. I just know that I regret it.
Yeah.
And I probably harm people, because I can see evangelicals harming people now, but I didn't have the eyes to see that maybe I was harming people. So I have a lot of grief for that. I don't like to think that I hurt people, and I probably did. So I realized I think it really, at least it helped me. I don't begrudge people. If people are angry, I was angry, so I would never judge anybody for being angry. But for me personally, I think when I realized that my anger was really grief, it helped me be less angry. It helped me to just let myself grieve and go through that process of grieving. And so now I don't feel quite as angry anymore.
Yeah. I think there's a part of me that can get angry in a sense, I guess, if I really think about it. But I definitely feel like, there's a drive that a lot of us have to really get an audience with Christians who, there's going to be always fundamentalist Christians who are never going to listen to, atheists. Atheism is just stupid to them. I was one of those people. But there are people who are going to say, you've got something to say. So to those people who will be willing to listen, I think I've really got a strong desire to say, how can we be as gracious as possible while still holding some boundaries and some lines to say, I'm sorry, but I'm going to land on that your worldview is, at least especially to children, it's psychological abuse. To tell children this stuff. But I still want to come across as gracious as I can in the interactions. And I definitely think angry atheists can definitely end up just, shutting doors that otherwise, if you just held back a little bit, the door might have stayed open long enough to have the conversation. And who knows, you may have made some progress. But
the reason that I work so hard at recovering from my religious trauma is not just for myself, but I don't want to live a life where I can't interact with any religious people without feeling triggered.
Yeah.
Because that's what 90% of the people in this world, right? So I don't want that. I want to be able to be friends with religious people. And even if I may find their views completely polar opposite to mine, I feel like there's nobody agrees with me 100%. I have to be able to connect with them somehow. And so, yeah. So, but there's a season for everything. There is a season where I had to cut off everybody who triggers me to keep my body safe, to prioritize my body safety. But I think for the end goal of being able to open myself up to people again, without projecting my pain and lashing my trauma out on people. So that's one of the reasons why I work on religious trauma recovery. Yeah.
That's so important. Well, I did have one last question, and then I know we need to wrap up. The whole topic of raising kids in a different way. My platform and my passion is focused primarily on giving kids the information about where ancient mythology came from that affected Judaism and Christianity, how it evolved in the Bible. But in addition to, in a sense, raising kids free of ignorance about those things and giving them the information, that's in a sense almost like to clear the blank slate, but there's still other issues that even if you are not a Christian, you could still have issues with not, interacting with the world appropriately and healthily, and removing all the toxicity. And the ones I wanted to ask you about are, could you just share your heart at all about how to raise kids free of racism and homophobia? I know you talked a little bit about it before, but just anything that comes to mind that says how we can do a better job as parents in this generation, so that in the next generation, hopefully racism and homophobia are significantly dropping as a cultural, dynamic.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you can raise our kids free of racism because it's just part of the air that we breathe. I think I'm a racist, and I think my kids are probably racist because we have these biases that we grew up with that we can't shake. But what we can do is to become aware of it. There's a huge difference between denying that and accepting it, and then trying to learn and to do better. So I think just like we shouldn't raise our kids with sexual silence, with no education about sex and anatomy and predators and all this stuff, we tell our kids these things not to corrupt them, but to give them the language and the power to make decisions for themselves. And I think it's the same thing with homophobia and racism, is we have to give our kids education and vocabulary so that they can be aware of their own fragility around race conversations, their complicity, and then their advocacy, right? And so this just comes from having conversations with there's so many good resources. I recommend the book Raising White Kids for people who are raising white kids, by my friend Jennifer Harvey. So she gives really good advice on how to do exactly that, to just give our kids this education, so that they can navigate these conversations. But in a lot of ways, our kids have more to teach us. Like, my kids are Gen Zs, and the Gen Zs are an incredible generation, and they are living in a more diverse. They're living in a world where their peers are more willing to be fully themselves, and so they have a lot to teach us about the diversity of the people that we live and engage with. And same thing with homophobia. It's like you want to feel like we live in a world without homophobia, but we don't, right? Even after gay marriage, legal marriage passed, we still had shootings, and we still have hate crimes. And so just to not be afraid to talk about these hard things, these hard truths, that homophobia exists, that racism exists, and to choose who we want to be in this world, and of course, again, like I said, we cannot force our kids to be kind. We cannot force our kids to be whoever, but we can give them the education and the vocabulary, and the community, to make decisions to be the kind of person they want to be. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. And I think too, just to reiterate what you said earlier, of just being an example ourselves, they will be watching our lives, and hopefully if we're making some really good choices to remove the toxicity and be healthy, and caring to our community around us, with all the diversity that we have, hopefully they'll pick up on that and say, yeah, it's, my mom and dad and might have had, this about them that wasn't, I don't want to copy that and bring that into my, bag of tricks, so to speak. And I don't want to be like them in this way, but I do want to be like them in this way, that they were loving to people who were different, and they were loving to people of all, stripes, that just everybody around them, they did everything they could to encourage people to tell their stories and to be themselves, and to love those people as they are. Hopefully that kind of stuff, rubs off on them.
Well, and like I said, it's a collaboration. Hopefully they learn from us, and hopefully we learn from them, because homophobia and racial issues is about listening and believing in the existence of marginalized identities, right? And who is also marginalized is our children. They are also marginalized people as kids. And so the best way that we can model listening and believing in the existence of marginalized identities is listening and believing in the lives of our children. So if we can treat them that way, if we can say, listen, you are important to me, even though you may be invisible to so many people in society. I mean, children are literally invisible to people because they're short and they don't see them, and people don't get down on their knees and talk to them eye to eye. So it's like, if you treat them like you matter, your voices matter, then hopefully they will grow up to people who realize that invisible people, the marginalized people, that their lives are meant to be seen and believed as well. So for this trans people, this anti-trans legislation that's sweeping, they're trying to make the trans people invisible, right? They're trying to erase their existence. So if children, if they know that they exist and that we're to believe their existence, then the best thing we could do is listen to our kids. Or some of our kids may be trans.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Well, I appreciate those words. That's good. I hope people are listening. Well, I know we're short on time, but I did want to maybe just throw in one quick question. What's your next book?
Oh goodness, I don't know if I'm writing a next book. Yeah, I'm writing on Substack right now on just religious trauma mostly.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where my writing is focused on, but I don't know if I'm writing a next book yet.
Gotcha. If you did have one, what would a topic be that you might consider?
Uh, I would like to tell my story.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, if you do cross that bridge and you do it, please let us know. I'd love to have you on and be part of making that that book go and blast. But
Sounds
Cindy,
good.
I definitely just want to finish by saying I really appreciate what you've been doing. I know a lot of people, again, in the circles I go in, know your name already. For anyone that is watching my channel that doesn't know Cindy, please do get involved. Check out the links I'm going to put beneath the video. But you're doing great stuff. Your voice is so precious to a lot of us. I know you don't know all of us, but a lot of us know you. You've definitely been part of helping us to think through a lot of issues. So I think I'm speaking for a lot of other people and saying just thank you. Thank you so much for what you've been doing and what you continue to do. Your voice has just been absolutely, golden in our process. And we need people like you to normalize, to use the title of your book, or of your groups, Raising Children Unfundamentalist, to just say we can do a better job than we were, than previous generations. And we're going to raise our kids in a way that's it's just going to give them so much of a chance to have a better life than we could even imagine for ourselves, free of the toxicity and the trauma. And it's like, let's do it. And I appreciate you've been urging people to think through and say, basically, I mean, it feels like a lot of what you do is like saying, are you really giving them the best and the healthiest version of life that we can? And it's like, you're real gentle. You're not in people's faces, but you're kind of, it's like you're just asking, is this the best we can do? We can do better than this. And you ask really good questions and make good points. I love some of the little clips you post and your thoughts. And it's like, we need to do that. We need to ask ourselves these hard questions because, we have one shot. And, some of these kids, as the cliche goes, it's a blink of an eye and it's over, they're out the door. It's like, you got a shot at this. And especially if they're still young and little,
That's right.
Give them the best shot. And sometimes that means first taking a look at ourselves and figuring out, what do we need to heal from and think through, but then, turn the focus on them and say, give them the best of ourselves and of life. And I love what you've been doing in that realm.
Yeah, I do believe if we change the way we parent our kids, we can change the world. Because our formational years just it's just so important to our development and who we are as adults.
Yeah. I love to just looking in their little eyes and you just think, you just want them to be happy. You see their little twinkles. And I've got a little girl who's just turned 3 and, her little curls and stuff. And she looks at me with these big blue eyes and just sparkle. Her face just sparkles. And you just think, I just want to bless your socks off. I want you to be so happy in your whole life, right now as a little girl and your whole life. And yeah, it's such a blessing to be able to give them a really good launching pad for their life in every way. So
yes.
Cool.
That's awesome. I love it.
Yeah. Well, we've been speaking with Cindy Wang Brandt. Cindy, thank you so much. Great to hear your story. We definitely want to hear from you again, but thank you so much for sharing what you did today. We really appreciate it. And I look forward to the next time.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.